the ontological model and Gnosticism. Now this video is going to be based almost entirely on the ontological argument for the multipersonal God by Sinaiticus Apologia, so I recommend you check that video out to get some context on this one. Now first let me clear up some terms from that video that I'll be using quite a bit. So number one is the ontological model, which is the cosmological model implied by Sinaiticus' argument. Basically that there exist greater, lesser, and neutral making properties and entities which can possess them, such as the ontological God, or OG, or the maximally great God, an entity which possesses all great-making properties to a maximal extent, and the maximal lesser, which is the inverse, a maximally lesser being which possesses all lesser-making properties to a maximal extent. While not mentioned in the original video, it has been acknowledged to be required by the model. So the purpose of this video will be to take the 8 core assumptions of Gnosticism and reconcile them with the ontological model, and in doing so assert that Gnosticism is a valid worldview under the ontological model. So we'll start with number 1, the demiurge exists. Now it's been acknowledged that a maximally lesser being must exist. Under the scientific interpretation it would exist in the 0th dimension as an anchor for all of reality. As such, a being that is maximally lesser would also have the lesser-making property of arrogance to a maximal degree, meaning that despite being a lesser being, it would believe itself to be the highest being, perhaps the only being, and to be God. This fits the description of the demiurge given in many Gnostic texts. Number 1 and number 2 are somewhat intertwined. Number 2, the demiurge has the ability to create. Now, the ability to create is a property as defined by the ontological argument. Now, Sinaiticus has asserted that the ability to create is a great-making property. However, because you can create both negative and positive things, you can create things which are divine and beautiful, but also imperfect and negative, I would argue that the ability to create is instead a neutral-making property. Now, the OG, despite being maximally great, possesses all neutral-making properties, and that does not lessen his maximal greatness. And so, as such, a maximally lesser being could also possess every neutral-making property and still remain maximally lesser. Thus, the maximally lesser being would still possess the ability to create, which would mean that the maximally lesser being now has the same traits, personality, and abilities as the demiurge, and as such we can assume that it would act as the demiurge would, and so from this point forward we can refer to it simply as the demiurge. Next we must talk about aeons, and aeons are a bit difficult to define because there are so many disparate interpretations among the Gnostic community. But the definition that I will forward is that because the OG is multipersonal, there must exist aeons which are abstract representations of the aspects of God or the monad, rather than entirely autonomous entities in and of themselves. I can assert this because together they form the pleroma, Greek for fullness, which refers to the totality of divinity. And totality of divinity is simply another term for the ontological God or the monad, and as such the aeons represent aspects of the monad. You can also prove this using the mathematical concept of group theory. In group theory, you can have something like an equation, per se, and that equation has solutions which can be mapped in the complex plane. And when these solutions are mapped, they each have a set of symmetries. Now, you can define the equation under group theory as the group of its solution symmetries rather than a single equation. Now, defining it this way does not mean that it's no longer a singular entity, but rather you are defining it as a group of its aspects. I would argue that this same thing can be done with aeons in the monad, as demonstrated by the extended trinity diagram that you can see here, wherein the aeons, while being disparate from each other, are each aspects of and are the monad or God. The next assertion is the material gradient, which is the argument that the pleroma, the abode of the monad or the monad in and of itself, is representative of the 10th dimension under the scientific interpretation of the ontological argument. Under the same interpretation, there also exists a 0th dimension, or an inverse, an emptiness, which opposes the fullness of the pleroma. And the material world, or the world that we live in, all of the dimensions in between, represent a gradient bridging these two states. Now, since there is a fullness, there would also need to be, under this argument, an emptiness. And with that, we have the kenoma. Now, the kenoma is Greek for emptiness, and it exists as an opposition to the fullness of the pleroma. Under Gnosticism, it is the abode of the demiurge and the origin point of the archons. It can be interpreted as the zeroth dimension. However, certain Gnostic texts define the Kenoma to be utterly empty, and thus that would mean that the demiurge could not exist within there. Now, a theory that can resolve this dilemma is the theory of the negative dimension. Now, as you travel downward from each spatial dimension, you each one has its own representation of the cube. As you go down from the fourth to third dimension, you have the hypercube to the cube, and then to the second, the square, the first, the line, and the zeroth dimension would be the point. Now, because the Kenoma is the maximally empty, one could argue that it exists in a dimension lower than the zeroth, which contains no point. It is defined as the absence of a point, rather than the point, which is the zeroth dimension. This would solve the dilemma of the Kenoma being maximally empty. Now, a reminder that this assertion is not supported by science or by mathematics, and it is not required for the Gnostic assertions to be true. It is simply an alternate hypothesis which could possibly solve the dilemma of the Kenoma being maximally empty. Okay, so the next assertion refers to the archons, but before we can do that, we need to get some set theory out of the way. Now, set theory is a mathematical idea which refers to sets, which are basically groups of objects. Now, when you have two sets, you can perform operations between them, such as the union, which simply combines them. Another aspect of set theory is the null set or empty set. It's a symbol which refers to a set which is empty. Now, one of the operations you can perform between sets is the complement. Now, what that means is that it results in a set which contains everything that the original set does not. Now you might say, oh, wouldn't that mean that every result of a complement is infinite? Because if you have a set like 1, 2, 3, that would mean that every possible number that isn't in that is represented, and thus it would be infinite. Well, not necessarily, because usually when working with sets, you have to denote a set known as U, which stands for universe, and that refers to all the possible numbers that you were working with. So if you took the complement of A under this U, the resulting set would only contain about 5 objects. Now, if you want your complements to be infinite, you can also set your U to be, the set of all integers or the set of all real numbers. But what's important to this argument is what would happen if you wanted to take the complement of, say, the null set. Well, this results in one of my personal favorite mathematical statements, and one which is incredibly relevant to the discussion of archons, believe it or not. The complement of the null set is U, which is interesting in and of itself, but also interesting because of its implied inverse, that the complement of the universe is the null set, which implies that everything which is contained in the universe is what is not contained in the null set, and vice versa. Now, how does this refer to the archons? Well, just as the pleroma can be described as the group of aspects or properties, the same can be said for the kenoma. And by the complement statement, all aspects which are not represented within the pleroma or the universe would need to be represented within the kenoma, and vice versa. As such, these aspects would need to be represented by entities much like the aeons, and so this results in the existence of the archons. And because these archons represent all that is not represented within the pleroma, they represent the maximally lesser making properties, and as such, they would act in turn with the maximally lesser being, which results in them acting as quote-unquote servants of the demiurge, despite the fact that they really aren't. So the next assertion is that the demiurge was birthed from Sophia, or rather the event of Sophia attempting to comprehend the aeon Bythos. Now it's important to remember when talking about aeons that they are representative of aspects of the ontological God, and as such, the aeon Sophia, representative of wisdom, is a manifestation of God's wisdom. And the aeon Bythos, representative of depth, is the representation of God's depth. So it follows that Sophia attempting to comprehend the aeon Bythos is comparable to God's wisdom attempting to comprehend God's depth, or in other words, the ontological God attempting to comprehend itself in its totality. Now, a question that arises here is, can God comprehend himself? Is God incomprehensible, and is it possible? Well, whether or not God is incomprehensible or not, being the maximally great being, it is possible for it to comprehend itself, but there will be a few consequences. Now, these consequences are denoted here. If God is able to comprehend the totality of his being, it would follow that in that moment he would also be able to comprehend the possibility of things which are not within his totality, and thus are not his being. As the maximally great, the ontological God's thoughts take form in reality, and as such, the world as we know it would be created in this event. Now, because the demiurge, or the maximally lesser being, is necessitated by the existence of the world, that is, the demiurge is required to exist if the world exists, the existence of the demiurge is a direct result of the ontological God comprehending itself. As such, the demiurge was effectively birthed as a result of Sophia's act of comprehension towards Bythos. The seventh assertion is one of the more difficult ones to prove. It is that the demiurge is integral to the creation of the material world. Now, the demiurge was originally conceived as a solution to the problem of evil. However, in recent years, many have refuted this, saying that the solution to the problem of evil is free will. And while I would agree that an imperfect world, here defined as a world which contains evil and suffering, is required for free will, one could also argue that the ontological God, being the maximally great being, could not imbue the world with imperfections, as it does not have any, being the maximally perfect being. Using the demiurge as a proxy entity does solve this dilemma, as knowing the demiurge's creations would all be imperfect as it is the maximally imperfect, the ontological God could simply allow the demiurge to create the material world and imbue it with its imperfections, so that the ontological God's perfect creations, beings like humans, animals, and things which contain the divine spark of the pleroma, can experience free will without the ontological God having to compromise its perfection. Now, the conclusion is the eighth assertion of Gnosticism, that Gnosticism is still monotheistic. I have heard often that the problem with Gnosticism is the problem of two higher beings. The demiurge and the God cannot coexist because it would no longer be monotheistic. However, Gnostics do not see the demiurge as a higher being, nor a being worthy of worship or adoration. The common phrase, the blind idiot, is not a nickname that one would give to an object of worship, but it is given to the demiurge nonetheless by Gnostics. The demiurge is necessary for reality and for free will to exist. However, it is only allowed to do so within the confines set by the true God, the monad, the maximally great being. The demiurge has the ability to create, but the ability to create is not a great-making property, and thus the demiurge can still be lower, and as such, it is not a god by any stretch of the imagination, and as such, Gnosticism is still monotheistic. And with the eighth assertion proven, one can now say that Gnosticism is a valid worldview under the ontological model.